Imagine the moment when your bank account first reaches $10,000. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. You are still living in the same place, following the same routines, interacting with the same people, yet something subtle but precise shifts in the way you perceive money. It is not excitement in the usual sense, and it is not a feeling of victory. It is closer to a quiet recognition that money has changed its role in your mind. Before this point, money tends to behave like a current that moves through your life, arriving and disappearing with little resistance. After this point, it begins to feel like something that can be held, measured, and directed. What makes this threshold interesting is that $10,000 is not a life-changing amount in practical terms. It does not remove financial pressure completely, it does not provide long-term security, and it does not grant freedom in any absolute sense. Yet it marks a psychological boundary where your relationship with money becomes less reactive and more structured. Below this level, most financial decisions are shaped by immediacy. Expenses appear, and money responds. Income arrives, and it is quickly absorbed into existing patterns. There is little distance between earning and spending, which makes it difficult to observe the system as a whole. Once that distance begins to appear, even slightly, the entire framework starts to reorganize. Instead of thinking in terms of whether you can afford something right now, you begin to think in terms of what maintaining or growing a balance actually requires. The question shifts from short-term permission to long-term structure. This is where a different kind of awareness develops, one that is less emotional and more analytical. To understand why this shift matters, it helps to look at how financial behavior operates below that threshold. Most people do not struggle because they lack income entirely. In many cases, they earn enough to create some level of savings over time. The difficulty comes from the way income is distributed across decisions that feel small in isolation but become significant in repetition. A single purchase rarely defines a financial outcome, but repeated patterns do, and those patterns are often invisible while they are happening. At lower balance levels, money does not accumulate easily because it is constantly being redirected toward maintaining a lifestyle that adjusts itself to match income. This adjustment happens gradually and often without conscious intent. As income increases, so do expectations, and those expectations translate into slightly higher spending across multiple categories. The changes are rarely extreme. They appear as marginal upgrades, slightly better choices, or more frequent conveniences, each one justified on its own. The result is a system where income and expenses grow together, leaving little room for accumulation. From the outside, it can look like stagnation, but from the inside, it feels normal. There is no clear moment where a person decides to prevent themselves from saving. Instead, the system quietly absorbs any surplus before it has a chance to become visible as a growing balance. Reaching $10,000 interrupts this pattern, not because it is impossible to spend that amount, but because maintaining it requires a different level of attention. When a balance becomes large enough to notice, it introduces friction into spending decisions. Each expense is no longer just a transaction. It becomes a reduction of something that took time and consistency to build. That awareness changes the emotional weight of spending without requiring any external rules. This is where financial psychology becomes more important than income itself. Two people with identical earnings can have completely different trajectories depending on how they interpret and respond to this threshold. One may see $10,000 as available money, something that can be used to improve current comfort. The other may see it as a baseline that should be protected or expanded. The difference between these perspectives is not technical, it is interpretive. From a mathematical standpoint, the threshold also introduces the concept of accumulation as a visible process. Before this point, growth is often too small to notice. Saving a few $100s in a large flow of transactions does not create a strong signal. After this point, even small percentage changes begin to feel meaningful because they apply to a larger base. A 5% increase on a small balance is barely noticeable, but on a larger one, it starts to register. This is the beginning of a feedback loop where progress becomes observable, and that visibility reinforces behavior. When people can see that their actions are producing measurable results, they are more likely to continue those actions. The system becomes partially self-sustaining, not because it is automatic, but because it provides enough feedback to support consistency. At the same time, this stage introduces a new kind of tension. Maintaining a balance requires resisting the natural tendency to convert stored value into immediate experience. Every financial decision becomes a comparison between present satisfaction and future stability. This comparison is not always comfortable, and it does not have a universally correct answer. What matters is that the decision is now visible as a trade-off, rather than an automatic response. If we zoom out further, this threshold also reflects a broader structure within economic systems. Most financial environments are designed to encourage circulation rather than accumulation. Money is meant to move, and many of the incentives people encounter are aligned with that goal. Discounts, subscriptions, upgrades, and financing options all reduce the perceived cost of spending while maintaining a steady outflow. Reaching a stable five-figure balance means partially stepping outside of that default flow. It requires creating a small buffer where money is not immediately assigned to consumption. That buffer is fragile at first, because it exists within a system that continuously pulls resources back into circulation. Protecting it requires awareness, and that awareness is exactly what begins to change long-term behavior. Over time, this shift can extend beyond the initial amount. Once a person understands what it takes to build and maintain $10,000, the same principles can be applied at larger scales. The numbers change, but the underlying structure remains consistent. Accumulation depends less on single decisions and more on patterns that are repeated with enough consistency to produce visible results. This is why the first threshold often feels more significant than subsequent ones. It is not the size of the number that matters most, but the change in perception that comes with it. After this point, money is no longer just a tool for managing the present. It becomes a system that can be observed, adjusted, and gradually expanded. The important detail is that this shift does not happen automatically when the number is reached. Some people pass through this level without any change in behavior, treating it as a temporary state rather than a structural transition. In those cases, the balance tends to return to its previous range, because the underlying patterns have not been altered. For others, the threshold becomes a reference point, something that redefines what feels normal. Once a higher baseline is established and maintained long enough, returning to a lower one can feel like a loss, even if nothing external has changed. This creates a form of psychological resistance against dropping below that level, which can help stabilize long-term behavior. If you look at this process from a distance, it becomes clear that financial progress is less about sudden changes and more about gradual shifts in how decisions are framed. The $10,000 mark is simply one of the first points where those shifts become noticeable. It represents a transition from reacting to money to thinking in terms of systems. And once that perspective begins to take hold, it tends to influence everything that follows.